There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has no good explanation. You weren't running. You weren't fighting. You sat through a dinner, a meeting, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, and you came home feeling like you'd survived something. No one around you seems to understand that. Because from the outside, nothing happened. But you know what was happening. The whole time, part of your mind was somewhere else entirely. Reading the room, cataloging the silences, measuring the weight behind a word someone used that didn't quite fit. You noticed the moment a person's smile didn't reach their eyes. You felt the temperature of the conversation shift 3 seconds before anyone else did. And then you carried all of it home, turned it over, and couldn't sleep. Most people would call that a gift. Perceptive, intuitive, sharp. What they don't see is the other side of it. The smoke detector that screams at a candle flame. The soldier who cannot stand down after the war ends. The room with every light blazing at 3 in the morning while the rest of the street is dark and quiet. And before we can understand why this awareness becomes a prison, we have to go back to the moment the first brick of that prison was laid. And for most of these people, that moment was childhood. But let's be careful here, because the story doesn't start the same way for everyone. Psychology has identified 2 distinct origins for this kind of hyper-awareness, and they are not the same thing, even though they produce people who look remarkably similar from the outside. The first origin is biological. There is a documented trait, sensory processing sensitivity, that some people are simply born carrying. Researchers estimate it shows up in somewhere between 15 and 20% of the population, and it is not a disorder, not a diagnosis, not something that needs to be corrected. It is a nervous system configuration. These individuals, sometimes called highly sensitive persons, process sensory and emotional information at a fundamentally deeper level than most people around them. The world doesn't arrive to them at normal volume. It arrives amplified, layered, and dense with detail that others filter out without even noticing the filter exists. For them, a crowded restaurant is not just loud. It is a simultaneous broadcast of 17 conversations, the scrape of a chair, the slight tension between the couple by the window, the waiter's forced cheerfulness, all of it arriving at once at full signal strength. This is not a choice. It is not anxiety, exactly. Though it can produce anxiety, it is simply how the nervous system was assembled. The second origin is different, and in some ways, heavier to carry, because it was earned, not chosen, but earned through circumstance. Neuroscience calls this state hypervigilance, and it does not come from a wiring diagram. It comes from a childhood that demanded it, ways we recognize in movies. Sometimes it is far quieter than that. Maybe there was a parent whose mood shifted without warning. Maybe love was conditional in ways no one ever said out loud. Maybe the house was simply tense, and no one ever explained why, and the child had to figure it out alone, the way children always do. By watching, by listening, by learning to read the room before the room could read them. A child in that environment cannot afford innocence. They become something closer to a radar station. They memorize the particular sound of tires slowing on the gravel driveway, because that sound tells them whether the evening is going to be safe or not. They learn to gauge the force of a cabinet door closing in the kitchen, not because they are paranoid, but because that information is genuinely useful. It tells them whether to walk into the living room or to disappear quietly into their room and wait. They become expert at the micro-signals of adult emotion, because their sense of safety depends on reading those signals accurately. What is happening inside the brain during all of this is not mysterious. The amygdala, the structure deep in the brain that processes threat and triggers the fear response, is being activated repeatedly, consistently, over years. And the amygdala is a fast learner. It records the pattern. This environment is unpredictable. Danger can arrive without announcement. Constant scanning is the only rational response. No one teaches the child this. The nervous system teaches itself. It builds the architecture it needs to survive, the same way a tree growing near the coast bends permanently toward the inland, shaped by a wind that no longer blows. The Stoics understood this process, not in the language of neuroscience, but in the language of formation. Marcus Aurelius, in one of his private journal entries, wrote something that still lands with unusual force. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He was not writing about productivity. He was writing about character, specifically about how character is formed by resistance, not by comfort. The child who had to become a radar station was not broken by that experience. They were forged by it. The forge is brutal, but what comes out of it is real. Epictetus understood this from the inside. He was born into slavery. He did not choose his circumstances. His body was not his circumstances' shape, but cannot own. His entire philosophy grew from the recognition that the world forms us, and then we decide what to do with what the world made. Now, that is the key distinction. The origin of hyper-awareness, whether it is biological sensitivity or survival architecture, is not the person's fault. It is not a character flaw. It is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence that the nervous system did exactly what nervous systems are designed to do. It adapted to its environment with remarkable precision. The problem is not the adaptation. The problem is what happens when the adaptation outlives the environment that required it. The amygdala that learned to scan for danger in a childhood home does not receive a memo when the person moves out at 22. It does not get a debrief. It does not stand down. It keeps doing its job with the same urgency it learned in the years when that urgency was genuinely necessary. The night watchman keeps walking the perimeter long after the threat has passed because no one ever told him the war ended, and because in his experience, the war always came back. That survival architecture does not disappear when the danger does. It moves into the office, into dinner table, into every ordinary Tuesday, and it shows up in 6 unmistakable signs. That survival architecture does not disappear when the danger does. It moves into the office, into the dinner table, into every ordinary Tuesday, and it shows up in 6 unmistakable signs. The first one is the most visible and also the most exhausting, not just to live with, but to watch from the outside if you happen to love someone like this. Call it permanent analysis mode. The inability to let a moment simply be what it appears to be. Here is a small, completely ordinary example. Your boss sends a message on the company chat at 4 in the afternoon. 7 words. "Come see me for a minute later." That's it. No punctuation drama, no capital letters, no exclamation point, no period. Just those 7 words sitting on a screen. For most people, that message is a meeting. They glance at it, think sure, and go back to whatever they were doing. But for the person we're talking about, those 7 words are not a message. They are a detonation. The moment the notification appears, something in the chest tightens. The mind begins running a threat assessment with the speed and thoroughness of a federal investigation. Was the tone off? Why for a minute? Does that mean it's minor? Or does a minute mean he wants to contain the damage quickly? Did I miss a deadline? Was it something I said in the meeting last Thursday? They replay the last 3 weeks of interactions, searching for the crime they must have committed, because why else would this feel so loaded? And the thing is, nothing has happened. The message was neutral. The boss probably needs to confirm a meeting time or ask about a client file. But the nervous system has already rendered a verdict. This is not paranoia in the clinical sense. It is a brain that was trained to read between lines for survival, now applying that same training to a world where the stakes are dramatically lower, but the alarm volume has not been adjusted. Neuroscience has a name for what's happening underneath this: the default mode network, the brain's system for self-referential thought, for reflection, for mental simulation, tends to be more persistently active in people who carry this kind of awareness. In most people, that network quiets when they engage with the external world. It fires up during rest, during daydreaming, during the space between tasks. But for the overly aware person, it does not stand down. It runs in parallel. One half of them is present, nodding, holding a coffee cup, participating in the conversation. The other half is in a back room somewhere, reviewing footage, cross-referencing data, building a case. The result is a kind of invisible double shift. They can spend an entire day sitting at a desk and arrive home more depleted than someone who ran a half marathon, because their brain has been running its own marathon the entire time, one that has no finish line and awards no medal. Seneca saw something like this coming, not the neuroscience, obviously, but the trap of a mind that cannot stop examining itself. He wrote with the kind of bluntness that ages well. Seneca wrote, "There is nothing so ruinous to good character as to idle away one's time at some spectacle, for it is then, through the avenue of pleasure, that vice more easily makes its entry." He was talking about distraction, but the principle cuts both ways. A mind that never rests, whether from distraction or from compulsive analysis, loses the capacity to simply inhabit its own life. The examined life, which philosophy rightly prizes, becomes something else entirely when examination never stops. It stops being wisdom and starts being surveillance, which brings us to the second sign, and this one is quieter, more interior, and in some ways more cruel than the first. When the analytical lens has been running long enough pointed outward, it eventually turns around. And when it does, it turns the same relentless scrutiny on the person behind the eyes. Psychology calls this metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. It is one of the higher functions of the prefrontal cortex, and in measured doses, it is genuinely valuable. It is how people catch their own biases, revise their assumptions, grow. But for the overly aware person, metacognition is not a tool they pick up and set down. It is a switch that was never installed with an off position. They do not simply feel an emotion. They audit it. Picture this. They are at a dinner with friends, good people, a warm room. Someone just told a joke and they laughed. A real laugh, spontaneous, unguarded. And then, almost before the laugh is finished, a part of their mind floats to the ceiling and looks down. Was that too loud? Did it sound genuine, or did it sound like they were performing enjoyment? Should they have laughed that hard at that particular joke, given what that person went through last year? The joy is still there, but it has been interrupted, cross-examined, and something in the natural flow of the moment has been broken. It is like trying to dance while watching your reflection in a mirror the entire time, not to enjoy the movement, but to correct it. You might not miss a single step. Your form might be technically perfect, but you have lost the thing that makes dancing worth doing. The unself-conscious presence, the surrender to the rhythm. The Stoics understood the difference between productive self-examination and compulsive self-surveillance. Marcus Aurelius kept his journals as a private act of honest reckoning, not to punish himself, but to realign. There is a discipline in that. A judge who reviews the day's decisions before sleep, then closes the book and rests. What the overly aware person carries is something different. It is the judge who cannot leave the courtroom, who goes home and retries closed cases, who reopens verdicts that were already settled, not because new evidence has arrived, but because the mind cannot tolerate the uncertainty of finality. And the cost of that is not just exhaustion. It is the slow erosion of presence. The depth of their awareness increases. They see more, feel more, process more, but their ability to simply be somewhere, without commentary, without evaluation, without the running transcript in the background, quietly disappears. When the analytical lens has been running long enough, it does not stay pointed at the self. It turns outward, and it begins to see things in other people that most people are never meant to see. When the analytical lens has been running long enough, it does not stay pointed at the self. It turns outward, and it begins to see things in other people that most people are never meant to see. There is a particular kind of moment that overly aware people know intimately. A coworker stops by your desk on a Tuesday morning. They set a coffee down in front of you, your order remembered correctly, and they say something warm about the report you finished last week. Genuine smile. Good eye contact. Everything on the surface reads as kindness. And for about half a second, you feel it. The warmth. The small lift of being seen. And then your brain quietly opens a second window. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, "I am now going to analyze this person's motives." It simply begins. What does this person need? What are they building toward? Is this the prelude to a favor request? a political alliance, a subtle repositioning before the next round of performance reviews. You're not cynical. You don't want to think this way. But the scan runs anyway, automatic and thorough, like background software you never installed and cannot uninstall. This is what psychology calls a heightened theory of mind. The ability to model other people's inner states, their intentions, their hidden agendas, the gap between what they say and what they mean. Most people have this capacity in a moderate form. In overly aware individuals, it runs at a frequency most people never reach. They don't just hear the words. They hear the architecture underneath the words. And here is where the quiet loss begins. It is not the loss of childhood exactly. It is something more specific and more adult. It is the loss of relational innocence, the ability to receive a gesture at face value, to let a compliment just be a compliment, to hear, "I'm fine," and believe it, to accept an apology as complete rather than as a diplomatic maneuver. That capacity, once it erodes, does not easily come back, and its absence creates a kind of loneliness that is very hard to name. To someone who has never felt it, you are surrounded by people who like you, people who mean well, people who are trying. But you are watching all of it from a slight remove, not because you are cold, not because you are superior, but because the layer of surface meaning has become transparent to you, and you cannot stop seeing what is underneath it. You are the only one in the room who can see the seams in the stage set, and you cannot explain what you are seeing without sounding paranoid or unkind. Zeno of Citium, who founded the Stoic school in Athens, taught that the wise person sees human nature clearly, not to condemn it, but to understand it without illusion. The sage in Zeno's framing is not a man who pretends people are better than they are. He is a man who sees exactly what they are and chooses his response with clarity, rather than with disappointment. Clarity without bitterness, sight without contempt. That is the ideal. But the distance between seeing clearly and living peacefully with what you see, that distance is real, and it costs something to cross it, because the loneliness of perpetual clarity is not a small thing. When you are the person who always notices the shift in someone's tone before they are aware of it themselves, when you are the one who reads the subtext of a room before anyone has said a word out loud, you begin to feel that you are living slightly outside the ordinary human experience of trust. Other people seem to move through their relationships with a kind of ease you cannot fully access. They take people at their word. They enjoy the coffee and the compliment without running the equation. And you watch them and feel something that is hard to categorize. Not envy exactly, but a kind of wistfulness. A wish that you could simply receive things the way they do. And then the awareness turns in another direction entirely. Because it does not only scan for motive, it scans for pain. This is the part that exhausts people most deeply, and it is the part they are least able to explain to anyone who doesn't share it. They walk into a room and they feel the emotional weather before a word is spoken. Two co-workers have had a silent argument. A friend is holding something back. Someone at the dinner table is performing happiness and doing it just well enough that no one else notices the performance. But you notice. You always notice. Neuroscience offers a partial explanation through the concept of mirror neurons, cells in the brain that activate not only when you perform an action or experience an emotion, but when you observe someone else doing so. In most people, these neurons provide a kind of social attunement, a baseline resonance with the people around them. But in the overly aware, this system seems to function like a tuning fork, placed in a room full of instruments. Every string that vibrates in the room vibrates in them. The friend who describes a divorce and goes home, while you carry the weight of it in your chest for 3 days afterward. The stranger on the subway bringing the knowledge of it alongside your own life. Psychology draws a distinction between cognitive empathy, understanding what someone else is feeling, and emotional empathy, actually experiencing what they are feeling, as if it were your own. For overly aware people, the line between those two things dissolves. They do not observe another person's pain from a careful distance. They absorb it. They become a sponge pressed against the emotional life of everyone around them. And by the end of the day, they are wrung out, not by anything that happened to them directly, but by everything they took in on behalf of other people who never asked them to. And the cruelest part of this is the asymmetry. They are the person others come to when something is wrong. They are the one who knows how to soften a conversation, to read the room, to say the right thing at the right moment. People feel understood around them in a way they rarely feel around anyone else. And that is a genuine gift. But it is a gift that is rarely reciprocated, not because the people around them are selfish, but because most people simply do not have the same antenna. They cannot feel what you feel. They cannot see what you see. And so the person who always understands others moves through life in a kind of quiet deficit, giving a form of attention they almost never receive in return. That emotional absorption does not stay in the mind. It migrates into the body itself, and the body begins to speak in the only language it knows, alarm. That emotional absorption does not stay in the mind. It migrates into the body itself, and the body begins to speak in the only language it knows. Alarm. Here is something most people never think about. Your body has its own form of awareness, completely separate from thought. Neuroscientists call it interoception, the brain's ability to monitor the internal landscape of the body itself, your heartbeat, the tightness in your chest, the shallow pull of breath when you walk into a difficult room. These signals travel up through the insular cortex, a strip of neural tissue buried deep in the brain, and get translated into something the mind can work with. For most people running on high alert for years, someone whose threat detection has been sharpened either by temperament or by the kind of childhood that demanded it. That translation process is not routine at all. It is catastrophic by default. Take something as ordinary as a cup of espresso. The caffeine hits. The heart rate climbs a few beats per minute. That is just chemistry. That is just Tuesday morning. But for a nervous system that has spent years cataloging physical signals as potential dangers, that slight acceleration does not feel like alertness. The insular cortex flags it. The amygdala cross-references it against its long archive of past threats. And within seconds, the mind is no longer in the coffee shop. It is somewhere else entirely, asking a question it has asked 1,000 times. Is something wrong with me? What follows is a loop that is almost mechanical in its cruelty. The physical sensation triggers a threat interpretation. The threat interpretation activates a stress response. The stress response releases cortisol and adrenaline, which produce more physical sensations, tighter chest, quicker pulse, a faint dizziness, which the brain then rereads as confirmation that yes, something is wrong. The loop feeds itself. The alarm that started with a single espresso is now running on its own fuel. And the person sitting in the coffee shop, to everyone around them, looks perfectly fine. This is not weakness. This is a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do. It learned somewhere along the way that missing a signal was more dangerous than overreading one, so it stopped missing anything. The problem is that a system calibrated for genuine emergencies does not know how to stand down when the emergency is a caffeine molecule. And when the body will not quiet down, the mind reaches for the only tool it trusts: control. Not control over other people, not in the obvious sense. Something more subtle than that. A kind of internal architecture project. If I can think ambushed by any of them, if I can map the terrain completely, I will never be caught without a route. Epictetus, who understood suffering in ways that most philosophers never had to, drew one of the most important lines in the history of human thought. He said, Epictetus wrote, "Make the best use of what is in the precise location where most human suffering lives." In the confusion between what we can actually govern and what we cannot. Our judgments, our intentions, our responses, these are ours. The outcome of a conversation, the feelings of another person, the way tomorrow unfolds. These are not. And the person who is overly aware, whose mind is always running forward into the future, is almost always confusing the two. They are spending their deepest energy trying to govern what was never theirs to govern. Think of a general who becomes so consumed with wargaming every possible scenario, every flanking movement, every supply line vulnerability, every weather pattern, that he never actually moves his troops. The maps cover every table. Contingency plans fill every drawer. He has thought through the battle in 40 different versions. And yet, the army sits still because no plan ever feels complete enough to risk. That is not strategy. That is the illusion of control wearing the costume of strategy. Or think of a chess player who calculates 20 moves ahead with genuine brilliance, and in doing so, forgets that the person sitting across from them is a human being, that the afternoon light is beautiful, that the game itself was supposed to be a pleasure. The calculation becomes the point. The living disappears. This is the cruelest trade that hyper-awareness offers. It promises safety through prediction. What it delivers instead is a life lived slightly outside itself, always in rehearsal, never quite in performance. The armor of anticipation is real. The protection it provides is largely an illusion, because the thing that finally arrives, when it arrives, is almost never the thing that was rehearsed. Pain finds the unguarded door. It always does. And there is a particular exhaustion that belongs only to this kind of person. Not the tiredness of someone who worked hard with their hands. Not even the tiredness of someone who carried a heavy grief. It is the tiredness of someone who has been running a simulation of their own life in parallel with their actual life every single day, and who is only now beginning to wonder what it would feel like to stop. That question, what would it feel like to stop, is not a small one. It is, in fact, the beginning of something. The question is not whether these people can stop seeing. They cannot, any more than an eagle can choose to have worse eyes. The question is what they do with what they see. The question is not whether these people can stop seeing. They cannot, any more than an eagle can choose to have worse eyes. The question is what they do with what they see. And that question is not new. It is, in fact, one of the oldest questions in the entire Western philosophical tradition, long before neuroscience gave us terms like sensory processing sensitivity and default mode network, long before therapists began charting the anxiety loops of the hyper-vigilant mind. Ancient thinkers were already sitting with this exact problem. They had observed the same human type. They had watched him carefully, and what they concluded was not that he was broken. What they concluded was that he was undisciplined, in a very specific, very precise sense of that word. Marcus Aurelius is perhaps the most instructive case in all of philosophy, not because of what he wrote, but because of why he wrote it. The Meditations were never meant to be published. They were private notes, a man talking himself down from the ledge of his own mind, night after night, in the margins of a life that carried enormous weight. He was emperor of Rome. He had every reason to catastrophize, every reason to run the endless simulations of threat and loss. And if you read the Meditations carefully, you begin to realize that he was not writing from a place of mastery. He was writing from a place of struggle. He was correcting himself, reminding himself, pulling his own attention back from the spiral. The book is not a monument to a man who had conquered his mind. It is the evidence of a man who was in the daily labor of choosing what his mind would carry. That distinction matters enormously for the person we have been describing throughout this conversation. Because what Marcus was doing in those private pages was not suppression. He was not telling himself to feel less, to see less, to care less. He was asking himself a harder question: of everything I am capable of perceiving right now, what actually deserves my sustained attention? The Stoics called the undisciplined version of the mind a kind of self-inflicted captivity. The sage, in their framework, was not a man without perception. He was a man who had learned to observe without being conscripted by what he observed. There is a practice in Stoic philosophy, sometimes called the view from above, the deliberate act of pulling your perspective upward until the immediate moment loses its false urgency. A slight pause before someone responds to your message, seen from ground level, can feel like evidence of something terrible. Seen from the altitude of a life, of a decade, of the full arc of a relationship, it is almost nothing. The same information, completely different gravity. The practice does not change what you see, it changes what you decide to do with it. This is not escapism. The Stoics were not asking anyone to pretend the world was simpler than it is. They were asking something far more demanding, that you develop the discipline to choose your focal length. The same lens, focused differently, the same glass, the same capacity for perception. But one orientation scatters the light into anxiety, and the other focuses it into something useful. And then there is a line from the New Testament that, when you read it as a cognitive instruction, rather than a piece of religious decoration, is almost startling in its precision. The Apostle Paul, writing from prison, not from comfort, not from safety, offers what is essentially a filter for the ruminating mind. Philippians 4:8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Notice what he does not say. He does not say stop thinking. He does not say ignore what is difficult or pretend that reality is less complicated than it is. He draws a boundary around what the mind chooses to dwell in. True, honorable, just, lovely. The overly aware person sees all of it, the true and the distorted, the honorable and the manipulative, the lovely and the ugly. The question Paul is raising is the same one Marcus was raising in his journal. You cannot unsee what you see, but you can choose what you give your sustained interior residence to. That is not a small distinction. That is the entire game. Because here is what the neuroscience and the philosophy and the scripture are all pointing at from different angles. Hyper-awareness on its own is raw material. It is not wisdom. It is not suffering. It is potential, waiting to be shaped by something. The person who has it and no framework for working with it will be consumed by it. The person who has it and some discipline, philosophical, spiritual, psychological, it almost does not matter which tradition, as long as it is honest, that person becomes something rare. They become someone who can hold the full complexity of a room without being destabilized by it. Someone who can see the fragility underneath another person's confidence and respond with patience rather than contempt. Someone who can feel the weight of a moment without mistaking the weight for a verdict on their life. The ancient philosophers did not call this a gift. They called it the beginning of wisdom, and they were careful to say that it was only the beginning, because raw perception, however sharp, is still just data. Wisdom is what you do with data after the seeing is done. That is the diagnosis philosophy offers. Not that something is wrong with you, not that you should want to see less, but that the capacity you carry is larger than the container you have been using to hold it. And the container, the framework, the discipline, the practice, that is what has been missing. Philosophy names the disease and points toward the cure, but the cure is not a concept, it is a practice, and that practice begins with 3 specific acts of release. Philosophy names the disease and points toward the cure. But the cure is not a concept, it is a practice, and that practice begins the way a muscle learns to stop bracing after years of holding tension. You cannot think your way into them. You have to practice them until they become the default, and even then, you will forget and have to begin again. That is not failure, that is what practice means. The first act is this: refuse to prosecute silence. You know the situation. Someone you care about takes 4 hours to respond to a message, not a complicated message, just something you sent out into the world, casual and open, and the silence comes back, and the mind, your mind, that extraordinary instrument that has been reading rooms since before it knew what rooms were, begins its work. It assembles a case. It reviews the last conversation for anything that could have landed wrong. It considers tone. It weighs the possibility that something has shifted, that something is ending, that you have, without knowing it, committed some invisible offense. And the actual explanation, the one that requires no trial and no verdict, is that the person is tired, or busy, or they set down their phone and forgot. The world is full of people who are simply exhausted, and exhaustion does not send a memo before it arrives. The Stoics had a name for what the mind does in that silence. They called it adding opinion to appearance. The appearance is neutral, a message, unanswered. The opinion is the story the mind constructs on top of it. Marcus Aurelius returned to this distinction again and again, not because he mastered it easily, but because he had to keep reminding himself. The appearance arrives. The suffering comes from what we attach to it. Charitable interpretation is not naivety. It is not pretending people are simpler or kinder than they are. It is the deliberate choice to extend the least painful explanation until the evidence demands otherwise. And for someone whose nervous system has been scanning for threats since childhood, that choice is genuinely difficult. It goes against the grain of everything the survival brain was harder. Observe the sensation without issuing a verdict. Anxiety arrives. The heart quickens. The chest tightens. The mind, trained to interpret every internal signal as data, immediately begins processing. What does this mean? What is coming? What have I missed? And the loop begins. The body producing sensation. The mind reading it as warning. The warning producing more sensation, and so on, until a perfectly ordinary afternoon has become a private emergency. The Stoic meditator, and this is a practice that goes back to the earliest Stoic exercises, learns to name the wave without riding it. Not to suppress it, not to analyze it into submission, but to observe it with a kind of calm curiosity. This is a sensation. It is not a verdict. It is not a prophecy. It is the body doing what bodies do, responding to the accumulated weight of a life spent paying close attention. There is something in the Gospel of Mark, the night before the crucifixion, in a garden called Gethsemane, that has always struck me as one of the most psychologically honest moments in all of Scripture. Jesus, who by any account understood exactly what was coming, did not suppress the awareness. He said plainly that his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow. He named it, and then he stayed present. He did not flee the garden. He did not dissociate from the weight of what he was carrying. He held the full knowledge of what was ahead and remained fully in that moment. Mark 14:36. Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. That is not the prayer of someone who has turned off their awareness. It is the prayer of someone who has learned that awareness and surrender can coexist. That you can see clearly and still release the outcome. That knowledge of the worst does not obligate you to carry it in your body every waking hour. If you find yourself returning to these questions about the inner life, about the weight of perception, about what it means to live with a mind that will not quiet down, this channel exists for exactly that. Not to give you answers wrapped in optimism, but to sit with the hard questions long enough that they become something you can carry rather than something that carries you. If that matters to you, subscribing means these conversations find you when they are ready, not when the algorithm decides to surface them. It is a small thing, but it keeps the thread alive. The third act follows from the second, and it is perhaps the most counterintuitive of the three. Withhold the insight that is not yours to act on. A person who sees deeply into others develops a peculiar burden. They notice the insecurity behind the bravado. They catch the grief underneath the cheerfulness. They sense the fracture in a relationship before either person in it has named it. And the instinct, the generous, exhausting instinct, is to do something with that knowledge, to name it, to help, to offer the observation that might unlock something for the other person. But a doctor does not absorb the illness of the patient. The skill of medicine is not empathy alone. It is the capacity to understand suffering clearly while remaining distinct from it. To diagnose without dissolving. To be genuinely present to someone's pain without becoming that pain. There are things you will see that are not yours to fix. There are truths you will recognize in someone else's life that they are not ready to hear and may never be. There are relationships you will watch straining under pressures the people inside them cannot yet name. And the deepest form of wisdom, the kind that comes after years of carrying too much, is learning to hold what you see without being obligated to act on it. This is not indifference. Indifference does not see at all. This is the discipline of the witness, present, clear-eyed, and free. When these three acts become habit, something the transcript calls remarkable begins to happen. And it is worth describing slowly, because it is the whole point of everything that came before. When these three acts become habit, something the transcript calls remarkable begins to happen. And it is worth describing slowly, because it is the whole point of everything that came before. The awareness does not disappear. That would be like asking the tide to stop reading the shore. What happens is quieter than disappearance and more lasting than any technique you could practice. The awareness matures. It stops being demand and becomes, slowly, a kind of companionship. You still see what you see. You still feel the temperature of a room before anyone has spoken. You still catch the almost imperceptible pause before someone answers a question they were not expecting. None of that leaves. But it no longer owns you. And that distinction between seeing clearly and being enslaved by the seeing is everything. Marcus Aurelius understood this. Every night in a private journal no one was meant to read, he wrote down what had unsettled him that day. Not to punish himself, not to solve it, una. He wrote it down so he could set it on the page and walk away from the desk. The world had not improved by the time he closed that journal. Rome was still fractured. The campaigns were still grinding. The court was still full of people performing loyalty they did not feel. He saw all of it. He recorded all of it. And then he chose, deliberately, repeatedly, imperfectly, what he would carry into sleep and what he would leave on the table. That was not the act of a man who had stopped seeing. That was the act of a man who had finally learned the difference between vigilance and wisdom. There is a figure that has lived inside this entire conversation, a watchman, someone stationed at the wall long after the siege ended, still scanning the horizon, still reading every shadow as a possible threat. That posture was not weakness. It was survival once. It kept someone safe when safety was not guaranteed. But the city is quieter now. The gates are not under assault, and the watchman does not have to descend from the wall because the world has become trustworthy. It hasn't, fully, and he knows that. He descends because he has finally learned to tell the difference between a fire on the horizon and a torch in someone's window. He can rest, not because danger no longer exists, but because he no longer needs every moment of his life to be a preparation for it. That is the shift, not from awareness to ignorance, from fear to something closer to curiosity, from scanning for what might wound you to simply being present for what is actually here. The book of Revelation, near its close, carries a line that does not belong to triumphalism or easy comfort. It belongs to transformation. Revelation 21:5. Behold, I make all things new, not erased, not replaced, made new. The past that shaped the watchman's eyes, the childhood that trained the nervous system, the years of reading rooms and predicting moods and absorbing what no one else seemed to notice, none of that is undone. It is not the thing that is removed. It is the thing that is transformed into something that can finally serve life rather than guard against it. The same depth, the same perception, but held differently now, carried with open hands instead of white knuckles. Think about what that actually means for someone who has spent years living with a ceiling light they could not switch off. A light so bright it turned every shadow into evidence, every silence into a verdict. The light does not go out, but it changes. It softens from a laser that exposes every fracture in the plaster into something warmer. A candle. Enough light to see by, enough warmth to sit near. Not so sharp that it makes the room unbearable to inhabit. That candle does not make you less perceptive. It makes you livable, to others and more importantly, to yourself. You can still read a room. You can still feel what is unspoken. You can still offer the kind of understanding that makes people feel genuinely seen, which is one of the rarest things one human being can give another. But you are no longer the one paying for everyone else's emotional debts with your own nervous system. You notice without absorbing. You understand without disappearing into the understanding. And here is what no one tells you about that softening. It is not a loss of depth. It is the arrival of something you have been circling for years, without a name for it. Call it freedom if that word doesn't feel too large. Call it rest if that feels more honest. Call it the moment you finally stop treating your own perception as a problem to be solved and start treating it as a faculty to be honored, and occasionally, gently set down. The people who carry this kind of awareness are not broken. They never were. They are people who learned to see in the dark because the dark was where they had to live for a while. And that skill, that hard-won, costly, exhausting skill, does not have to be a prison for the rest of their lives. It can become something else entirely. Not a wound, not a weapon, something closer to a lantern. If this conversation sat with you, if somewhere in the last hour you recognized yourself in the watchman, or in the child reading the sound of tires on the way home, or in the person at the dinner table who laughed at the joke and then floated to the ceiling to evaluate the laugh, share this with someone who would understand it without needing it explained. You probably already know who that person is. They are as a kind of company. And leave a comment with this, not which sign you recognized, but what you have been carrying that was never actually yours to carry in the first place. The answer might surprise you. It might also be the beginning of setting it down.